Hello, and welcome to the final segment of the Algebra 2 PLC for Unit 5, Applications of Probability. I'm James Key with the MCPS Math team here on the set of Homework Hotline Live. In this segment, we'll look at the content standards that are being addressed in Unit 5. Let's have a look together. You may find it helpful to know that by going to coursestandards.org and downloading the standards, you can just navigate on the table of contents to the standards that are labeled High School, Statistics, and Probability. Units 5 and 6 together address both statistics and probability, so you may find it helpful to read the narrative page as well as the overview page. But in Unit 5, we really are focusing on these clusters right here under the domain titled Conditional Probability and the Rules of Probability. So if you scroll to the second page, you'll see that header here, and there are actually 9 content standards that are being addressed in Unit 5. Let's take a look at them one by one. So key ideas include independence and conditional probability. Standard 1 demands that students be able to describe events as subsets of a sample space, breaking it into pieces. Potentially we'll look at a union of two sets, A or B, the intersection of two sets, A and B, or the complement of an event, for instance, the idea that event A did not occur. In Standard 2, students are looking at the idea that two events are independent and linking that to the notion that the product of their probabilities gives the probability that they both occurred, and understanding that that's true if and only if the events are independent. In Standard 3, students are asked to know, to determine the conditional probability of A given B, favorable to that situation requires that A and B both occurred. And if we're given that B has occurred, then the space of possible outcomes is limited to event B, which indicates why we're looking at a denominator involving the probability of B. So the conditional probability really is just a ratio of those two quantities. The standard goes on to say that we can interpret independence in terms of conditional probability by making the statement that A given B is the same as the probability of A if the events are independent, and the probability of B given A is the same as the probability of B alone, again, if the events are independent. In other words, if you're given that A has occurred, that doesn't change the probability that B has occurred. That's really what we mean when we say two events are independent. Under that same cluster heading, we have standards 4 and 5. 4 addresses the use of two-way frequency tables. Students should be able to decide, based on their analysis of a two-way table, whether or not two events are independent, and they should be able to determine conditional probabilities. Standard 5 really gets at the intuition around these ideas. And it just requires that students be able to speak in everyday language and to come up with everyday situations that illustrate their understanding of those two ideas. The second major cluster heading in this domain says that students should be able to use the rules of probability to compute probabilities of compound events in a uniform probability model. Standard 6 asks students to interpret probability, conditional probability of A given B, as the fraction of B's outcomes that also belong to A. I think it's really helpful to use a Venn diagram to illustrate that concept. So let me just sketch that in here. Let's suppose this is event A, and here are outcomes included in event B. And if we know that B has occurred, or given that B has occurred, then we know that our sample space is limited to events in B. And if we'd like to determine the probability that A has also occurred, we're really looking at the ratio of this area, which includes A as well as B. We're really looking at the ratio of this blue area to the total area encompassed by B. That's what that standard is really getting at. Standard 7 looks at the compound event A or B and requires that students be able to apply the addition rule, which says that we can add the two probabilities of the two simple events as long as we're careful to subtract the compound event where they both occur, and students should be able to interpret the results in terms of the model. Standard 8 involves the general multiplication rule. There's no requirement here that we know in advance whether A is or is not independent of B. This rule is true in general. And just to let you know, this idea is developed in SLT 8H, which is important to know because it's only required for students in Honors Algebra 2. Standard 9 involves permutations and combinations, and this is the one standard under this header that's developed in pre-calculus, not in Algebra 2. We do hope that by looking at the standards for Unit 5 that's helpful to developing your own understanding of what the target should be for student learning within this unit. And please think about, along with your PLC, how you'll communicate those learning targets to students. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.